I think, yeah, Cara addressed what I was firstly considering responding to both of your thoughts on the issue. And I think it is really interesting to think about it in the context of access, because I know in the base funding review, the University of Melbourne also argued that like a more market-based system would mean that students wouldn't, that the fees wouldn't increase that much if the fees did have partial deregulation. But in 2005, when there was partial deregulation and there was an increase, the universities were allowed to increase their fees by 25%. All universities did immediately increase to the maximum possible fees that they could in that situation. So to say that, oh, you know, it'll stay fair and it will stay equitable for all students is, I think, a really false thing given the historical context of that. So I think that if you're looking at it up to a 30% increase of fees, which is what the University of Melbourne did argue for in the base funding review submission and also in the recent graduate winners article by the Grattan Institute, like a 30% increase in fees is a really, really significant amount. And I think it's impossible to argue that that won't like decrease access, especially for students, you know, coming from the eastern suburbs and those sorts of areas where it is really hard for them to be able to, you know, afford university and that sort of thing. So I'd just like to hear the panel's response to that kind of in that historical context.
Glyn, obviously you've overseen a lot of change in the university. Do you think there are some valid concerns there?
There is no one in the room who doesn't think access is the key issue. And there are many things that prohibit people from universities, but curiously, the cost of going to university, the cost of the education is not one of them. And we have just lots of studies and lots of empirical evidence on this. It might sound counterintuitive, it might sound instinctively wrong. It isn't. We know that low SES people go to university at exactly the same rate as people from wealthy eastern suburbs, families on using their ATAR as the marker. So the system we set up does not discriminate against on the basis of disadvantage. The real issue is the one Simon pointed to. It's that low SES does not finish year 12 and does not get access to universities. And in 30 years, despite lots of programs to try and change that, we've made no impact on that whatsoever. We are still missing out on lots of people who just do not finish year 12 and don't get through, or go to schools where the year 12 results don't give them access to university. That is the core access question. That's who's missing out. And if we're serious about access, if that really is our driving passion, we've actually got to say it's not an issue of the university sector, but we must be part of the solution. And lots of universities are running links into TAFEs and links into year 12s and programs to try and encourage people, and I might say particularly women, to think about staying through to year 12 and then going on to university. And access is actually about who comes to campus. Once they've got through year 12, people come to universities in exactly the same rate, regardless of their socioeconomic circumstances.
Simon, I'm curious, with your experience in the field, whether you think there's a role for further public policy reforms to try and rectify some of these issues, and whether you think it's likely in the current political climate.
Political climates change. Nothing's fixed. And I think what public opinion and what student opinion has to say has an effect on the development of the political climate and can set new policy agendas. It's really a question of how do we most effectively make our voice heard and impact the policy framework. I think it's two halves to the argument. You know, there's the argument where we demonstrate that students should not have to pay as much as some people think they should have to pay, and I'm thinking of the graduate winners, and as people may know, I've been tilting against that in the Australian. The other half of the argument, though, is to persuade people out there who aren't in universities and don't share our, if you like, worldview and form of life, our kind of mode of life, that it's worth public supporting higher education as a sustained long-term and short-term national benefit. I mean, when 5% of students were in higher education and education was free, the argument that carried the public along, and it had always carried the public along in relation to government funding of universities, was that it was worth funding the social leaders, you know, that was a public good. Now that's an interesting argument, isn't it? Because it's an elitist argument in one sense, and in another sense it's a social argument. But it's no longer the issue that matters, because we're 33% and we hope 40% and we hope 50% participation. We hope to keep expanding the boundaries of access to higher education. then not everyone is a social leader by the old or new definitions. Everyone's just a person. So we have to be able to persuade the public that it's worthwhile providing its funding to support those people while they're in education. So we have to establish what the public benefits are. And that is not an easy task. I've got a couple of research projects looking at this comparatively, looking at what other countries, we've lost our way in English-speaking democracies to some extent on the public role, I think, of universities and public health and so on. But other countries are much firmer and clearer about what they expect. They expect high quality services, they expect universal services and so on. So I'm interested to see how other countries are arguing the basis of public funding of higher education to try to bring that back into our jurisdiction, because I think we need to reforge a much stronger argument for a democratic, publicly funded system.
Cara, in your position this year as the Education Academic Affairs Officer, have you seen concerns from students about the way the funding system currently works?
Unfortunately, I think the reality is that a lot of students aren't really aware of how the funding system works, and nor are they particularly aware in a lot of cases, I think, when huge government reviews like the base funding review are presented. And I think that's really unfortunate and, you know, goes back to a whole lot of issues around student engagement more broadly. But I think that it's really concerning when such huge discussions are being had that students aren't being consulted, and nor are they really being made aware, and no effort, I think, is going into kind of trying to get those opinions and make them heard. So, yeah.
Can we thank Eleanor for her question?
So what did you think of the responses? Jump online to oursay.org and post your comments. And while you're there, why not check out what new forums we've got running? Thanks for watching, and tune in next week for part 2. Welcome back, and you're tuning in to part 2 of the Dream Larger response event, where OurSay and the Melbourne University Student Union ran an online forum for 6 weeks, asking students to post and vote for questions about their education issues. Right now, we're putting the most popular questions to a panel of Vice-Chancellor Glyn Davis, Professor for Higher Education Simon Marginson, and Cara Hadgraft from the University of Melbourne Student Union. Let's go check it out.
I'd like to move on to the second question for tonight's discussion. It comes from Charlotte Miller. When she started her degree in 2006, it was in the pre-Melbourne model era, and she's observed a lot of changes within the department, particularly in history, which is the subject of her question. And with 167 votes, it goes as follows. Since 2007, the University of Melbourne School of History has suffered enormous cuts in both subjects and staff. Despite advertising for one new position this year, the school is still without a medievalist or a British historian and appears to have no plans to rectify this. This is despite the arts faculty being in surplus. And the question is, how can a university that doesn't value one of its oldest departments really be said to be one of the best in the world? Does the university have plans to restore the history department to its former level of staff and subjects? Glyn?
Thank you. So in 2005, there were, in effective full-time staff equivalents, which is how we measure people, 25 staff in the history department. In 2012, there are 20. So that's the difference between 2007 and now. And why the difference? Because a generation ago, 20% plus of students in the arts faculty did history. It was the single most popular discipline. It's the one most people did, and this university built a very fine reputation, particularly around Australian history, and I think did and continues to do, of course, superb work. In this institution around in the early 2000s, but accelerated from 2006, participation by art students in history subjects began to fall, and it has fallen quite dramatically. It nearly halved. It's begun to climb again, which is extremely welcome, but it's gone down. And some people attributed that to the Melbourne model, exactly the same numbers at University of Queensland, similar patterns in most Australian universities, except in arts faculties that have a much narrower range of choice. But broader the arts faculty, the more we've seen a decline in history. And that always faces an institution with a huge dilemma. of course you value history, of course you want to invest in it, but you have to think, so what do we say to the art students who are now choosing in large numbers criminology, global studies, media and comms, have a different set of choices from the generation before? Because every time you put money into an area where there aren't students, you're holding money out of an area where students want to be. And how you find the balance between preserving and protecting what's important and what is necessary for the future of the faculty, and history clearly is that, and accommodating the fact that student preferences are shifting becomes the dilemma. And it's a dilemma every university faces all of the time, not just in arts faculties, in every faculty we teach. Some areas go through huge booms and then collapse. In this case, we've seen a very strong historical area. Now only about 9% of art students choose to do history in their choices. Part of that is just the expansion of choice in the faculty. Part of it is clearly that as more students are doing history in high school, particularly Australian history, which is compulsory in many states, they are electing not to do particularly Australian history when they come to university. Whether they feel they already know it or they didn't enjoy it at school is less easy to say. So the dilemma for us is, how do we attract students into history to make sure that it's strong and viable? How do we deal with the fact it's very hard to sustain the range of subjects you'd like when you've got a much smaller student base than you once did? And how do you make history attractive, plausible, and enticing? And those are dilemmas for all of us.
Departmental politics is a complex matter, and there are various stories and narratives around the arts faculty about what's happened in the last 10 years and how different departments have gone, and there are other departments that have got different kinds of cases, and there are some which could bring a story about declining numbers forward, others who would bring a different story forward. But I think there was a period where history did extremely well within the distribution of resources, and there's been that period has passed, and there's something of a corrective, I think, has occurred. Now, I can't get any closer to the facts of the matter than that, but I do think that it's a really important part of a humanities program, that you'd like to see every student in the university study history. I think it's very explanatory in terms of all professional contexts, all understanding of all life situations. It's a generic discipline of great value, and I think all of us who have got any contact with the discipline would be quite determined to make sure that history is strong at Melbourne and viable into the future.
Cara?
I think I agree, it's an incredibly complex issue, and I mean, one of the things I think is obviously there's declining student numbers in a lot of cases, but I wonder how much of that is also kind of self-serving in the fact that I know when I started my arts degree, one of the things that made me switch is the fact that I had no choices in first year, and the choices that were available to me was something that I'd covered in year 10 at school. And so I think that there's a couple of things going on in leading it into and making it a very complex problem. I mean, I was quite surprised to kind of be looking over the old handbooks this afternoon, sort of researching this question, and there were 20 first year subjects in the history faculty in 2006. Like, that to me is just incredible. And sure, you can make the argument that it's not viable, and in many cases I'm sure that's true, but it seems to be such a shame that so much of this knowledge is lost from and opportunity as well is lost from our university curriculum. And I guess one of the other things to think about is whether or not there is a place for reviving some of these courses in this new and exciting age of MOOCs, massive online open courses, and whether the university can redirect itself and say, well, maybe our courses aren't viable in particular history majors, but what we can do is we have these, we have these lecturers who are already lecturing in majors that we have available, but they also have a specialty in medieval history, and what we will do is offer classes that used to be taught online for free. And that way, I think, because at the end of the day, universities do have to be financially viable, but they are about being repositories of knowledge, not only for students now, but by training our new researchers and by encouraging this kind of inquisitive nature of subjects that aren't necessarily taught. So I think there's definitely possibility for those history subjects to perhaps be catered to in the future, but it is obviously very complex.
like to hand it over to Charlotte, who's obviously got a very important stake in this issue, as she currently is a tutor at the university.
Thank you. Thank you for your answers. I particularly agree with Cara saying the idea about options and choice. Like 2006 was the year I started and there were 20 first-year history subjects, so now I think there are 3. Maybe 4 next year. I mean, I think it's a bit of a chicken and egg argument saying that students are less interested in history, but then there's less choice, so that doesn't really encourage them to be interested. And I just refer to, there was an external review of the history department last year in August, and it suggested that the department needed to reinvest in history. And it suggested the appointment of a medievalist, a Southeast Asian historian, and also an environmental historian. And it also clarified this by saying that these appointments couldn't be made until senior staff in history retired. This year, 2 senior staff in history actually have retired. So I was wondering, given that that was an external review and that was a suggestion in the review, whether those appointments would be made.
One of the important findings of that review that you mentioned, which was an external review of eminent historians, most from outside Australia, is they contrasted to a certain extent the way we had managed history with the way Sydney University had managed history. And they noted that Sydney had developed, as numbers declined, a new set of suites that spoke more to the interests of contemporary students and often linked to global questions and were less focused on particular periods and more on big questions that rolled out over historical eras. And whether you like that sort of history or not, Sydney has significantly lifted its numbers of students doing history in the way that we haven't. And the Sydney department is now significantly larger because just as departments shrink as numbers shrink, so they grow as student demand rises. So that report also had some important lessons for us. And I know Trevor Bernard, the head of department who commissioned that review, has taken very seriously. I'm aware of the point. I tried to get answers on that, not tried to get it. I asked through colleagues in the office today about those 2 positions I was interested in. There have been 2 appointments into the history program this year, I was told, this afternoon. You mentioned 1, but I think there might have been a second. And I'll have to take on notice the question of what's happening with those specific. It's a level of detail I'm sorry I don't have.
Simon, I wonder what your thoughts are of the role of having really high-quality teachers, because obviously in this day and age where students can talk to their friends on social media, they can report instantly about their perceptions of a lecturer or a tutor and the quality of the teaching of a subject, and whether there's an important role for improving teacher quality to sustain some of these subjects that might otherwise be in jeopardy.
I think Cara's mentioned the $64,000 question, which is the move